Welcome everyone. You're very welcome to our first ever online conference. We hope that you'll find in it the warm and stimulating experience that we have come to expect of DSA conferences. Widening online access to our conference is something that we have been thinking about for a few years now, both as a way to extend inclusion of those who find it difficult to travel to the UK, especially those based in the Global South, and as a way to reduce our carbon footprint. But as we talked about the possibility of virtual presentations or even full sessions, we never imagined that this would be the year that we would take the entire conference online. There may be bugs, there may be things that don't quite work, so we hope that you'll be forgiving and will bear with us. As we're all aware, what pushed us to take the conference online was a global pandemic that has sent shockwaves all around the world. This has brought the fault lines and deep crevices of inequality and injustice that we in development studies have long been aware of out into the open for all to see. As we know too well from earlier disasters, it has hit hardest those who were already most vulnerable. In such a context, the theme of our conference, New Leadership for Global Challenges, could not be more relevant. New forms of leadership in new directions are exactly what we need. I believe that development studies is particularly well placed to respond to this challenge. We're used to thinking across disciplinary silos, recognizing that complex problems require thinking and working in a collaborative way, drawing on many different kinds of knowledge and experience. We know the importance of local ownership and of working with the particular histories and geographies of specific locations. We know that solutions will not be sustainable unless they are developed through dialogue, and that the most important part of dialogue is making space for people who are not usually listened to speak, and for those of us who are used to speaking to listen. I believe that conferences like this can be a part of that dialogue as we spend time listening to and talking with one another. You are very welcome. Since we're online, we don't have the usual notices about toilets and fire exits, but we do have a couple of notices of a practical nature. If you want to raise a question, please do it through using the question mark in your toolbar, not through the text chat. So we'll keep the text chat for technical issues that you need to raise with Nomad IT. And if you have problems, the best thing to do is probably just to hit refresh in your browser. And that should hopefully, on the turn it off and turn it on again principle, sort most things. While we've now gone global, our original plan was to have the conference at Birmingham. So the theme was proposed by Birmingham, and Birmingham have done the heavy lifting in terms of the academic work behind this conference. I'm therefore now going to ask David Hudson, who is professor at Birmingham, to introduce the conference theme. Thank you, David.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And indeed, it's my privilege on the behalf of the university, the International Development Department, and all of my colleagues to welcome you to Birmingham, or at least to Shindig. And more on this virtual space, our space for the next 4 days in a bit. But this is where I would normally be able to say that, well, welcome to Birmingham. Did you know we have more miles of canals than Venice? Please do go and try and enjoy Birmingham's culinary contribution of Balti and enjoy our beautiful campus, especially the brand new parkland in the middle of campus, but not this year. So we hope that in the pictures and the backgrounds here at Shindig, we at least give you a flavour and the spirit of being in Birmingham, and hopefully you'll be able to visit soon in the not so distant future, and you are all always very welcome. The last time the DSA conference was held in Birmingham was 2013, which was the International Development Department's 50th anniversary. The department has a very well-established reputation and expertise in public administration, and also a very strong politically informed approach to development studies. And so the conference theme on leadership then was very much a natural outgrowth of this. And so, as Sarah said, back in July 2019, we proposed the theme of new leadership for global challenges, because we felt there was a really strong case for developing a better understanding of the role of effective and developmental leadership and to try and address these global challenges that the world faces. So climate change, gender inequality, all axes of exclusion, migration, displacement, populism, and the collapse of the international liberal order. I think it's fair to say we can now add pandemics and global diseases to that list, and probably a global recession. And here's where the question matters. Where will the political will to address these most pressing global challenges come from? And we believe that leadership is absolutely fundamental to addressing all of these problems and more. But whose leadership, and what does leadership mean? Here in IDD, we have the Developmental Leadership Programme, which is an Australian-funded research programme that has since 2006 explored the role of leadership in enabling and blocking developmental change. It was established by the late Adrienne and subsequently directed by Heather Marquette, and now under Claire McLaughlin, Chris Roach, Alana Tomlin, and myself, is just starting an exciting new chapter. Now, DLP has always argued that leadership is always collective. It's about coalitions and networks, not just leaders. And it's always political as well. There are trade-offs, conflicts, settlements, power and ideas. And crucially, it happens everywhere, at all levels. The back streets, community halls, factory floors, peasant movements, youth networks, offices of local government buildings, even households in the family. And in the current conjuncture, we're seeing new spaces of leadership opening. So we're hearing about meetings in the Pacific that are now conducted in the national language as opposed to English, because there are no donor staff there. Youth leadership organizing online to combat coronavirus conspiracy theories. Community groups organizing to protect livelihoods, and city-level leadership is more important than ever. And so these expressions of agency, of leadership, remind us that action is possible, but that it always happens within and is hemmed in by the existing social, economic, and cultural limits of society. And we have to ask who is legitimate to lead, and this is contested and defended and won through the political and cultural battle of ideas. So it is these questions and issues that the conference theme for this year, New Leadership for Global Challenges, requires us to address. And in all the papers and panels and the 3 keynotes, we will all collectively reflect on the opportunities and challenges facing leadership in the world, where these new spaces are opening. What are the new forms of leadership? Well, how does collective leadership work? And how do leaders inspire followers to overcome and challenge existing norms and institutions? The COVID-19 pandemic has changed everything, and yet it has probably also changed nothing, in the sense that all of these pre-existing challenges are still here. And in reality, they're not only still here, but they have been amplified by the virus. And the impact of the pandemic has been refracted through these existing challenges, as Sarah said. It has acted as a spotlight, bringing older fractures and inequalities back to the surface, and also seen suggestions of new forms of leadership and new spaces. And Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter. While the protests might be an awkward coincidence from a public health perspective, from a social justice perspective, the coronavirus has really laid the socioeconomic inequalities bare and has placed the spotlight on the structural racism of many societies and the creaking institutions of government, and also the toxic leadership that fuels these grievances. These are old fights. They have their own histories, and parallel struggles for social justice are happening across the world with their own histories. And indeed, we all have to display our own leadership in our own spaces and organizations to relentlessly interrogate how our work, organizations, teaching, research, conferences are racist. It's hard, it's costly, it's expensive, and it requires privilege and advantage to be given away, but we must, and we will. And in a moment, I'll be handing over to the amazing Srilata Batliwala for the first keynote. And over the next 4 days, look amazing. We have panels and papers covering everything from xenophobia in South Africa to female leadership in Vietnam's most excluded ethnic minority group, and 3 fantastic keynotes. So today, we have Srilata Batliwala looking at rethinking leadership for global challenges. Tomorrow, we have Alpa Shah, who's speaking to what if we selected our leaders by lottery. And then on Thursday, Shireen Hassim, We Are Not Poor, New Forms of Resistance in Durban in South Africa. Very exciting. And finally, before handing back to Sarah, I just wanted to say thank you for the bold leadership in making this conference happen. I think this is one of the first large-scale association annual conferences that has gone online and indeed embraced it. And there are so many upsides, like Sarah said, in terms of inclusion, accessibility, affordability, lower travel pollution costs. And thank you so much to the team at Nomad IT that have made this happen. They have been brilliant. Also the DSA leadership that have shown us the way. And also to my colleague and local organizer, Fiona Noonan, who is an extraordinary colleague and has been relentless in helping make this happen. And thank you all for coming. These are really stressful and tiring times for many of us, juggling various commitments. So let's make this a very kind and inclusive space over the next few days. And with that, I'll hand over to the first keynote, and have a great conference, everybody.
Thank you, David. So the first keynote is about to happen. And we will begin with an introduction from Nandini Guptu, who is speaking for the sponsors of the keynote session, Oxford Development Studies. Nandini, are you there?
Yes, I'm here now. Okay, good morning, everyone. And again, I'm delighted to welcome all of you, not only to the conference, but of course to this plenary session on behalf of Oxford Development Studies. It also gives me enormous pleasure to welcome Srilata Batliwala, whose work has been such a great source of inspiration for scholars and activists working from the perspective of critical feminist scholarship. We are truly privileged to have Srilata to give this year's ODS lecture. Sarah will introduce Srilata to you in greater detail in a moment, but I would like to take a few minutes to talk about Oxford Development Studies, notably to announce our relaunch this year with the first issue in March. So we've just relaunched the journal. As a development studies journal, for years, of course, we have felt we needed to do something about the asymmetries in knowledge production and circulation between the global South and the global North. And we felt we needed to take the journal in new directions in order to reach a wider audience and also to ensure the representation of a wider range of voices in the journal. To this end, we have restructured our governance and organization. We used to have a UK-based editorial board and an international editorial advisory board. Instead, we now have a small team of associate editors and, of course, the chief editor, who manage the journal day to day and ensure the speedy and efficient handling of submitted articles to improve our already above sector average record. In addition, we have now created a composite international advisory board, editorial advisory board, with an emphasis on the inclusion of scholars from the global South. We've also taken this opportunity to rebalance the gender composition of the editorial board. as a result of which the International Editorial Advisory Board is now overwhelmingly composed of women and colleagues from the Global South. We now hope and expect that we will be able to publish research, high quality research from scholars working in the Global South who are usually marginalized from international publications. And all of this is, of course, very much in the spirit of this conference. Of course, we will continue to eagerly welcome papers from scholars working in the Global North. Therefore, I would like to urge all of you to submit your papers. We will continue to support early career researchers, as we've done before, along with, of course, senior scholars. And we will continue to award the annual Sanjay Lal Prize to an established academic and also to a doctoral researcher. Finally, with our relaunch, we have inaugurated a new series entitled Critical Issues in Development. I'm very pleased to report that the first article in this series was published in our March relaunch issue. And the article arose from the ODS-sponsored lecture given by Anne-Marie Gertz in 2018 at the DSA Conference. The series is intended to reflect critically on key themes and challenges in development and help set the future agenda for research and development studies. We would very much like to hear from you if you would like to propose a contribution to this series. I shall now hand back to Sarah, and like everyone here, I'm eager to listen to Srilata's lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Nandini. So as Nandini says, it's a tremendous pleasure and privilege to have Srilata Batliwala to speak with us and give us our first keynote today. Srilata has for many years been one of the most interesting and critical voices who has engaged with both development practice, but also critical thinking about development. She's currently Senior Advisor, Knowledge Building with Creating Resources for Empowerment in Action, which is an international organization that works at the intersection of gender, sexuality, and human rights. Srilata is also Senior Associate, Gender at Work, a global network of gender experts, supporting organizations to build cultures of equality and inclusion. Her work focuses on building knowledge from practice, especially in the areas of feminist movement building and feminist leadership, and on capacity building of young activists and organizations to advance feminist visions of social justice. Through the past 4 decades, Srilata's work has spanned grassroots activism, building movements of marginalized grassroots women, research and scholarly work, policy advocacy, grant making, and capacity building of young women activists around the world. Up to the mid-90s, Srilata was involved for over 20 years in grassroots work in India, where she helped build large-scale women's movements that mobilized and empowered tens of thousands of the most socioeconomically marginalized rural and urban women in slum communities in Mumbai and in the backward districts of Karnataka state in South India. Thereafter, she worked internationally, including a civil society program officer at Ford Foundation, New York, research fellow at Harvard University's Hauser Center for Nonprofit Organizations, and then a scholar associate at the Association for Women's Rights in Development. She has also served on the boards of several international and national women's rights and development organizations. Srilata has written and published extensively on a range of women's issues and is best known for her work on women's empowerment, women's movements, feminist leadership, and feminist approaches to monitoring and evaluation. Her most recent publications are All About Power, a primer for activists, Engaging with Empowerment, an intellectual and experiential journey, and a collection of her writings of the past 20 years. Since her lecture this morning is going to be talking about connections between the personal and the political, I think it's appropriate for me to end by saying that Srilata commutes between homes in Bangalore and the Nilgiri hills of South India, and is an active feminist grandmother to her 4 grandchildren. Srilata, you are most welcome.
Good day to all of you. I send greetings to all the delegates participating in the DSA conference and to the conference organizing team who so nobly rose to the challenge of reorganizing this huge event from an on-ground to an online one within months. I'm honored to be invited to speak here and to deliver this keynote address. The theme of the keynote, you will agree, is very broad and begs unpacking. Sarah and David have already given us a few broad strokes of what this terrain involves. But I tried to unpack these terms in my own limited way to try and understand what do they mean in the current context and how do we address them. So I tried to take a fresh look, and I hope what I offer is that. I've also tried to take a more feminist approach to understanding the challenges that our world is currently facing. So I would like to move slightly away from the widely recognized ways in which the challenges have been framed so far. Global warming and climate change, of course, poverty, conflict, pandemics, violence, and particularly sexual and gender-based violence, extremism of various kinds, and the rolling back of an entire body of very hard-won human rights thanks to the resurgence of hate-filled, exclusionary, obscurantist ideologies and authoritarian leaders and regimes. But while these are all critical, they are all challenges, and they are all certainly global, I believe that these ways of framing the challenges has in fact pushed us towards siloed solutions that are not very intersectional and therefore less effective. At best, they address perhaps just a couple of the intersecting effects of each challenge, but not more. So we have excellent analyses, for instance, of the connections between extractive industries and climate change and the pollution of people's water sources. We have connections between poverty, natural disasters, and migration, between fundamentalisms, the retreat of women's rights and conflict, or between disease pandemics and increased gender-based violence and rising poverty. But these challenges intersect, I believe, in far more complex and even diabolical ways. They represent a set of more intricate, perverse confluences, as my friend Lisa Vennaklasen of Just Associates called them, that remain poorly analyzed. And the problem, I believe, is that our capacity to respond to these challenges in more impactful ways has been exacerbated by the way we are framing the challenges to start with. For similar reasons, I believe it is necessary to rethink our understanding of what is global. For most of us, the term global has a particular meaning, even a particular location, even if we are not consciously aware of it. We consider something global because it's happening in multiple locations around the world, such as the current pandemic, or because it's happening within or through some kind of multilateral mechanism like the UN, or processes like climate change or trade talks. While these are indeed some facets of the global, I would like to offer a third frame, which I believe is really important and relevant today more than ever before, which is the Colombian scholar Arturo Escobar's notion of meshworks. I believe today's concept of the global needs to be located here in Escobar's idea of complex webs of interconnectedness between individuals, social systems, organizations, movements, between interests and ideologies, between business and nation states, and between information, communication, and surveillance systems, with all of these meshworks, of course, fueled by technology, markets, and the vast array of social inequalities and ecological and humanitarian disasters that are shaping our lives on a regular basis. Our global reality today, indeed, is meshworks. So virtually everything we think and do, how we live and die, is connected in some way to the interests and actions of others who may be far removed from us in geographic, economic, or political terms and power. And notice that I use the plural meshworks because there are multiple global meshworks with greater and lesser degrees of connection to and engagement with each other, and with both destructive and constructive objectives driving them. I would therefore urge all of us to step further back and take a more cosmic view of the global challenges of our times. I think we need to probe the deeper forces that are at work today and get to the heart of the matter. My humble attempt to do this has led me to propose that there are three deep and most fundamental global challenges facing us today. The first is discursive. By this I mean the whole domain of ideas, visions, and ideologies that are driving our political, economic, social architecture and relationships, and of course, our relationship with Mother Earth. The second fundamental challenge, I believe, is relational. How we locate and identify ourselves, how we relate to each other, how social groups relate to each other, and how we together as a species relate to other human beings and the planet. And the third global challenge is psychic. This is about the self, the inner self, our inner world, our emotional world, and our state of wellness or unwellness, our internal harmony or disharmony. This framing may seem surprising. You may ask, what about the challenges arising from the distribution and control of material, human, and natural resources, of technology, of markets and financial architecture, of governance and political power? But in fact, I believe that these are results, they are products and manifestations of these three deeper challenges. Here I am building on the very interesting, if controversial, concept of axial shift, or theory U, articulated by Otto Scharmer and his colleagues at the intriguingly named Presencing Institute at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Scharmer and his colleagues articulated theory U, which some of you may have heard about, which in essence asserts that we can't solve 21st century problems applying 20th century frameworks, solutions, and strategies. So he argues that we need an axial shift because the axes along which our societies and the entire world are being polarized or driven are no longer that of the left and the right and the progressive and the reactionary, because there are entirely new confluences and divergences that must be recognized and addressed. And Sharma and his team do this in terms of two cycles. The cycle of what they call absencing is characterized by the closing of hearts, minds, and will. Absencing builds on fostering fear, anger, hate, and ignorance, which always lurks within those who feel disenfranchised, silenced, marginalized for some reason or in multiple ways, and disconnected from the earth and from nature, or within those who feel they have lost a position of social dominance which they believe is their right. So, for example, it is racist white people anywhere. It is the rise of Hindutva in a country with an ancient history of pluralism like India. It is fundamentalists of every hue, and it's millions of men in every corner of the world. Absencing works through processes of desensing, blinding, and blaming. In short, the absencing cycle closes systems and mindsets, creating exclusion and little or no connection to the other, and the subjugation and destruction of both nature and other human beings. The other cycle, which Sharma calls presencing, is characterized by the opposite, by open minds, open hearts, and open will, and it builds on seeing, sensing, learning, clarifying, and most importantly, co-creating. It's the hundreds of thousands of people marching against racism right now as we speak. It is the hundreds of thousands of youngsters in high schools across 110 countries participating in a climate strike and demanding that action be taken to save the planet for them. It's millions of women coming out on the streets to dance in the 1 Billion Rising campaign, demanding an end to gender-based violence. And it's the Sinhala and Tamil women who joined hands during the civil war in that country to demand an end to the conflict and protest the disappearances of their children. The presencing cycle opens systems and mindsets and fosters inclusion, building multiple connections to myriad and diverse others, respecting and nurturing the planet and its resources. For me, though, both absencing and presencing should not be seen as a binary, but as processes or spirals that draw us into a place of psychic and social wellness and ecological wellness, or into a state of psychic and spiritual disharmony and ill-being. You notice that both the cycles, both the axes, identify psychic states as quite critical. Lack of empathy and fellow feeling, anger, etc. So this, I think, forces us to confront a simple reality that has, I think, been told to us by almost every religious philosophy and by most major systems of human change, that each of us is a part of the problem and we are a product of the problem, and each of us can be part of the solution and of creating solutions. So those of us who are attracted to the politics of hate and othering and exclusion, who are desensitized, are in need of spiritual and psychic healing. And the social structures in which we are embedded are in equal need of such healing. because we are products of an alienating social and economic environment. So I just want to say that I have actually rarely met anyone who is spiritually centered and operates from a place of psychic wellness, who adopts destructive beliefs or follows a path of violence and destruction in either their personal or political beliefs and actions, though I have seen many such individuals silenced by the forces swirling around them. So the link between the psychic challenge and the relational one and their integral connection is obvious. Boundless greed, the search for power and control, for domination, and ideologies that promote and justify these, whether economic, political, or cultural, create a set of human power relations and planetary impacts that have brought us to this precipice. And we permit our leaders to do business or govern our countries in ways that lead to devastating the Earth's environment, driving people to consume more and more, contribute to the growing mountains of waste that are destroying our oceans, depriving a vast number of the world's people of their fundamental human rights and healthy, sustainable habitats. Our world is riven with inequalities, violence, destruction, because it is based on discourses and psychic and social equations that enable all of this to happen. So the task before us, the deepest and perhaps greatest global challenge of all, is to strengthen, amplify, and expand the forces of openness, inclusion, regeneration, and creation, and simultaneously to increasingly isolate, weaken, and ultimately disempower the forces of exclusion, disconnection, and destruction. The current global crisis demands that we act on these three fronts simultaneously. There is no hierarchy among or between these. So let's look now at what is involved in addressing the discursive challenge. First, we have to create, expand, and popularize visions of another world, a different way of being with each other, a different kind of social architecture and organization that promotes and strengthens the cycle of presencing. We need fresh thinking, new ideas, and paradigms for how to organize our societies and our economic systems and relationships with the earth in ways that advance the well-being of all people on the planet. We need to create new visions and possibilities, even for those who currently embrace the ideologies that have brought us here. And the biggest challenge, especially for those of us who have worked in the social change field for a long time, is that we need new language, new ways of communicating these visions, imagination, creative methods, using art, music, imagery, theater, that won't make those who are either trapped in the cycle of absencing or simply confused or paralyzed to switch off and glaze over because all they hear is our jargon. We need exciting new ways to frame our ideas and politics. Luckily, we have all around us multiple new visions and paradigms that we can embrace and disseminate. So I'd like to share just a few examples. The first is Kate Raworth's concept of donut economics, which essentially proposes that we can, and indeed must, because we've run out of time, create economic systems that meet, on the one hand, the 15 identified in the Sustainable Development Goals without infringing the Earth's 9 ecological boundaries. A balance, she demonstrates, is entirely possible to achieve if there is social and political will to do so. Another interesting framework, which builds on an indigenous people of the Andes and from the Quechua language, a concept that they call Sumak Kauswe, is the notion of bien vivir or vivir bien. I think this was quite a popular framework about a decade ago during the Occupy movement and so on, which is essentially a way of doing things that is community-centric, ecologically balanced, and culturally sensitive. It's the antithesis of market-driven capitalism, but also of Western notions of the welfare state and of the individual as the bearer of rights. So this is not about the individual living well in this sort of new agey sense, but of the individual living in a way that ensures the well-being of our entire community and the Earth's habitat. So it challenges the notion, for instance, of natural capital by asserting that human beings actually don't own the Earth's resources, but are in fact dependent on them for survival. And that's why we have to nurture and use them sustainably. Its focus is on collective benefit, but is not, according to some of the scholars who've studied the concept, it's not about returning to some, romantic, primitive past. It's in fact about recasting our present ideologies, our present economies, and our present social architecture, and regenerating the natural environment in ways that are actually very similar to what Kate Raworth is suggesting in her Donut Economics. In the next slide, I've given you a little bit of a synthesis of the amazing cosmovision of the Mesoamerican women human rights defenders, or they call themselves the Defensoras. This is a network of hundreds of grassroots feminist activists, organizations, and movements working in Mexico, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua. It was created in response to the growing violence against them, their communities, and habitats by private companies and narco-traffickers in collusion with state actors. Their cosmovision is based on the idea of the connectedness and integrity of the body, the spirit, and territory, which is what they call their land or their habitat. Sorry, am I still behind in my slides, or am I all right? I think I'm all right now. I see the Mesoamerican. Sorry about that. So their analysis links grassroots women's struggles to protect their lands, their habitats, and their natural resources to their struggles for the integrity, security, and autonomy of their bodies, their sexuality, and their identities. They connect the issues of consent, criminalization, sexual expression, and gender identity to the degradation of the natural environment, and they highlight the intersecting nature of the power structures of capitalism, neocolonialism, patriarchy, and heteronormativity. They offer an integrated feminist approach to the safety and security of women's bodies, of our habitats, and of the earth itself. Another inspiring framework I would really encourage you to read is offered by author, healer, and social justice activist Adrienne Marie Brown in her Emergent strategy. This is a radical new discourse on how to build resilient, inclusive, vibrant change processes that are truly transformative. Brown's Emergent strategy is based not only on her on-the-ground experience and activism in social justice movements like Occupy and Black Lives Matter, but also, fascinatingly, on her study of insects, plants, bacteria, and viruses. Her insights come from exploring how plants thrive by interconnecting their roots, how hundreds of birds can fly in formation without colliding with one another by following very simple, clear, individual, local rules. I hope you noticed that I have the flock of birds flying in formation as the backdrop of this slide, because I think that image is such a powerful metaphor. She has also looked at how some plants, like ferns, create small-scale solutions and then scale them out to impact the larger environment, while others, like dandelions, build the capacity to regenerate themselves even when they are uprooted and trampled upon. Brown's core concept, though, is that connectedness and deep relationships determine the strength of a system, not its size or mass, and that each of us is a site of construction and change of entire systems. As she says, we must intentionally change how we live in ways that grow our capacity to embody the just and liberated world we long for. I'm not suggesting that any of these are complete or perfect visions. Many of them have been critiqued at many levels. My point only is that there are many inspiring frameworks and cosmovisions that enable us to bring about a discursive shift, to offer a new way of thinking, a new set of visions and narratives and frameworks for transforming the world, so that we can move away from the tired old frameworks that we've been using over the past century. Let me come now to the second big challenge, the relational one. The second requires work along a continuum that runs from the individual to the planet itself. And here is where I want to circle back to the concept of meshworks. In every corner of the world, and I have seen this for myself in my last 45 years in this field of work, there are incredibly creative and innovative visions and strategies that are being developed and deployed, often by unknown and unsung heroes. These innovators are confronting and navigating every day in their homes, in their communities, in their villages, neighborhoods, and cities, the global challenges, these perverse confluences that we've talked about. They challenge on their streets and in their forests and fields and rivers regimes and rulers that are often handmaidens of corporate interests, the growing holes in the ozone layer, displacement by the rising seas and hurricanes and tidal waves, the mounting levels of toxic, non-biodegradable waste that's polluting their waters, and the increasing and systematic violence against anyone who challenges or opposes these destructive forces. They confront every day the impact of poverty, patriarchy, discrimination, and violence. And these movements and their heroes, while doing this, have created entirely new models of leadership that break old molds of power over, of domination, to create leadership that's based on power with, to, and for. And I know that during the course of this conference, you are going to listen to many, many presentations and analyses of all these alternate leadership systems. And most importantly, these struggles have mobilized hundreds and thousands of others in their own communities and beyond borders to work together for truly global transformation. It was a very daunting task, let me tell you, to choose from among these myriad examples of processes that are reconstructing the entire relational domain. I've just chosen a few, and I'm probably going to skip one in order to save time. The women of the working class settlement called Shaheen Bagh in New Delhi. Poor Muslim women, very minimal education, who assembled and protested for over 100 days against India's new and highly discriminatory Citizenship Act. And by doing so, in their little open space, ended up catalyzing and mobilizing thousands of fellow citizens across the country, men and women of all age groups, religions, and regions, to come out in support of challenging this act and using very, very fascinating strategies like invoking articles of India's incredibly progressive and secular constitution and taking these articles and framing them as slogans and rallying cries, writing Urdu poetry, it is called shairi, with deeply political content, and painting murals invoking an image of Mother India embracing all its people and people of all its different faiths. There was no centralized leadership of this movement. I will not say much about Black Lives Matter because I think we've all been reading a lot about it. But once again, what interests me is that they have no centralized leadership in this movement. The movement thrives and is dependent on highly dispersed and multiple layers of leadership. The Liberian women's peace movement ended a decades-long civil war in that country, and one of the women who had been a key organizer of that movement, Lema Gabawi, became a co-recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize some years ago. They again organized across religious and ethnic divides. I'm emphasizing this because I'm trying to demonstrate how these movements have built alliances and connections across all these identities that have become so divisive in the current political scenario. And they used uniquely feminist strategies like telling their men who were participating, no matter in which group in the Civil War, if you don't put down, surrender your weapons, no sex and no food. And I do love the example of the Zapatista women of Mexico's Chiapas province, who, through a very long-term struggle, managed to craft and pass a path-breaking women's revolutionary law. This is a list of commitments that every citizen of Chiapas and every member of the Zapatista Liberation Army has to make, that include women's rights over their body, their right to autonomy, their right to reproductive decision making, etc. Women's leadership at all levels of the movement, and most importantly, freedom from violence and severe penalties for all those who violate women. Support for the law and among the rank and file of the Zapatistas and the adoption of it into what the Zapatistas themselves call their feminist constitution, because they treat themselves as an independent state, It was built through a painstaking process of consciousness raising and persuasion by some of the senior women comandantas, as they are called, of the Zapatista army. So all I want to say is that these struggles worked by building new equations between people, breaking the old norms and patterns of narrow identities, and by demonstrating that it is possible to create relational transformations that move away from hierarchies of power, privilege, and domination. They created entirely new models of leadership, as we've seen, based on a concept which I have always found extremely powerful and very feminist, Arjun Appadurai's notion of deep democracy, which means the democratization of spaces and functioning at every level, even the most intimate and private ones. Which is why I believe that to achieve this relational transformation, to meet the relational challenge, we need to build a global meshwork of these innovations, these leadership insights, and amplify the discourses that are implicit or explicit within them. Because I believe that then we can really create that axis of change that can move a profound, constructive, rights affirming, planet renewing confluence that can transform the world. Let's now come to the toughest one of all, the psychic challenge. The psychic and spiritual challenge brings me to a space and a discourse that I know makes many of us in the development sector, particularly in the development research arena, deeply uncomfortable. So let me come right out and say it. For far too long, we have created an artificial and false divide between social transformation and personal transformation. We have deluded ourselves that somehow we can work for social change and equitable, inclusive development without examining ourselves as sites of change, as sites of power. We have treated personal transformation as some sort of a private individual task and responsibility, and social transformation as a public and collective one. So we claim that a new world is possible, but march into it, as Arundhati Roy recently wrote, and I'll be coming back to this quote at the end, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, and so on. So we are ready and eager to fix the world, but not to question our own deeply internalized and largely invisible and unrecognized sense of power, privilege, bias, sexism, racism, casteism, homophobia, religious fundamentalism, and myriad other forms of bigotry. So we've deluded ourselves into believing that somehow global change is possible without looking within, without healing our own practices that have contributed to this global disaster. We don't examine our wobbly self-esteem, our fragile egos, our hunger for power, dominance, and all the unhealed pain and trauma that we carry within. And then, surprise, surprise, we construct organizations to catalyze social change, global change, and produce or reproduce within them the same power dynamics of the world we are trying to leave behind. Organizational theorists tell us that these dynamics in our organizations, our social justice organizations, then get submerged in what they call the deep structure or deep culture of our organizations. Another interesting aspect of this work was done by a psychoanalyst, Stephen Weinman, who studied survivors of severe trauma and abuse. And he speaks of the powerless rage that this creates within victims of such abuse. And so when they gain positions of power, when they survive the abuse and come into positions of power, they practice what he calls power under, which is a very oppressive use of power, out of fear that if you don't act as the oppressor, you will be the oppressed. Because in your mind, there are only two roles, because that's been your experience: victim or oppressor. I have seen startling examples of all these phenomena in the development, social change, and even feminist organizations I have been a part of or have worked closely with. I've been revolted by their sometimes toxic internal cultures, the authoritarian styles of leadership and hierarchy, entrenched patriarchal behavior by both men and women, hidden cliques in groups, all kinds of privilege exercised in terms of who is expected to do what, who gets a promotion and who doesn't, sextortion, gender discrimination, homophobia, disguised often as jokes or displayed through overt and covert harassment. My own personal experience reflects all of these. I have been sexually propositioned by the head of an organization working, listen to this, for gender equality. I have been a victim of feminist trashing by fellow so-called feminists. My character, sexuality, and politics were maligned when NGO leaders in the surrounding areas felt threatened by the kind of impact of the women's empowerment work that I was doing. I have witnessed young activists being threatened with termination if they dared to report sexual harassment by a senior staff member. I have seen, and this must be a uniquely South Asian or even Indian phenomenon, why blame the other South Asian countries? I have seen NGOs registered and funded to give in dowry to a prospective groom. I have mentored both women and men who are afraid to question any strategy of their organization or the use of funding in their organizations for fear of reprisal, which often takes very subtle forms. And I have seen leaders of powerful social movements aging, but refusing to let go because they are intoxicated with that power and have no sense of self beyond that leadership role. So we have to accept that we carry the virus within us because we are products of the societies and power structures in which we are located. And until we begin to recognize this, and until we not only acknowledge but focus on ourselves as sites of change, we can't change the larger world. Because, hell, we haven't been able to change even these small spaces, the so-called social justice organizations. Control, we've not been able to help people experience within those very confined, bounded spaces what this other world could be like. So we are, as Gandhi reminded us, microcosms of the change we seek in the larger world. And this is where I believe that the feminist mantra of the personal is political is so important, so relevant, and even more useful today than it has ever been in the past. Because we cannot create a healthy world, a healthy society, or a healthy planet with wounded, unhealed, and power-hungry people. Let's now move to the next slide. And I'm coming now to the last part of this oration. I'm actually running out of time, so it's good I'm almost at the end. What does all this imply for leadership? I sense that at this historic moment, we need leaders and leadership practices that will mobilize and unleash our collective power to do three key things. The first is to create and construct. The second is to resist and dismantle. And the third is to protect and preserve. And I will only offer a few brief thoughts on what each of these implies. For construction and creation, I think we need thought leaders or leaders capable of linking with thinkers, with visions, with new discourses, who will then offer us new ways of thinking about old problems, frameworks that will help us integrate the challenges of our time, take an intersectional approach to them rather than dividing them into boxes and providing us ideologies and providing us strategies that only work on one or two intersections. So we need leadership that can both heal and inspire us to act with compelling visions and words and forms and meanings. We need leadership that constructs our collective power for change, that can think and work intersectionally, as I said. And most importantly, we need meshworks of leadership that connects from the micro to the macro and back, that is experimenting, unafraid to experiment and scale on the ground, up, outward, and who can forge connections and alliances across and between social justice movements and struggles in different parts of the world. And most importantly, we need leaders and leadership practices that construct for us a model of and mirror for us that kind of internal transformation that is essential for social transformation. Second, we need to resist and dismantle, right? So we need forms of leadership that are capable of organizing us and building our collective capacity to do just this. And I believe I have given you several examples of leaders who do that. Third, we need to protect and, I'm not sure whether this is the right slide. Sorry. Yes. Protect and preserve is what I was talking about. So we need leadership that will mobilize us to preserve and protect not just ourselves and our fellows, but our habitats and our natural resources. So we really need movements that don't treat issues of the environment, of ecology as that movement's issue. It's every movement's issue. It has to be at the center of every movement. And we need leadership that will help us rediscover and restore practices from our own shared histories of the way we were living much more sustainably on this planet and living quite well without this kind of extractive and exploitative approach to the natural environment. And most importantly, we will need measures because of the level of repression and surveillance that we are seeing today that can protect and defend the rights of all those of us who challenge the dominant system. So it should be obvious by now that all this really requires a new and very different kind of leadership, not only in the political sphere, but in civil society, and that the current sort of macho, patriarchal, dominance-based model for the accretion of power, authority, and control is just not going to work, because that is it's that kind of leadership that has brought us straight to the ecological and humanitarian crises that we are now confronting. So we have to move in a radically different direction and expand and globalize these meshworks of new styles of leadership and leaders and movements. But to amplify their voices and impact, and to generate hundreds of thousands of other such leaders, we need to move away from our tired old ideas about leadership building, which tends to be very instrumental. It tends to be very how-to, not why. And I spoke about this process at length last year in the Research for Development Impact Conference in Melbourne, and I have shared a link to that talk because that was in a much greater depth on the issue of building alternative leadership, and I don't want to repeat that here. So I will then outline what I consider the critical elements for building the kind of leadership that we need today. The first and foremost is people willing and able to work on themselves. People who are willing to interrogate themselves and to recognize themselves as sites of change and transform their own practice, liberate themselves from power under when necessary, and who can really model for all of us around them the truth that personal transformation and social transformation are connected. Second, I think we need to move away from a range of myths, which in fact I detailed in my talk in Melbourne last year, that continue to distort our ideas about leadership, especially this individual hero and shero model, the obsession with power, with dominance, the notion that leadership can't be practiced without a formal position or vested authority. Because I want to remind us that some of the greatest and most transformative movements in the world were catalyzed by women and men whom no one authorized to do any such thing. Third, I think we need to learn from and amplify the experiments with shared dispersed leadership. And I know several sessions in the conference are going to do this. That abound in many of the most vibrant social movements around the world. How do they activate and unleash this power of seeing, sensing, caring, etc., and co-creating that is embedded within all of us? Because the truth is, ladies and gentlemen, leadership at its very heart is about the capacity to unleash the power of others, not our power to control others. And finally, to do all this, we have to begin the discursive, relational, and psychic change process within our own specific sites and locations, and particularly within organizations created to advance social justice and a sustainable planet. Because if we can't shift discourse, relationships, and levels of well-being in these bounded spaces, we cannot offer prescriptions for the world at large. So, of course, all of this is new. There are no roadmaps, no recipe books, no instruction manuals. It is indeed, as my dear friend Hope Chikudu from Zimbabwe, a peerless leadership builder and supporter of transformative movements. Hope was fond of saying, this is like building a helicopter while flying at 20,000 feet. But there is no turning back. Just as we cannot solve 21st century challenges with 20th century solutions, we can't tackle 21st century challenges with 20th century leadership. So we have to change our thinking, our relationships, and ourselves. Otherwise, as Chinese philosopher Lao Tse said, if you don't change direction, you will end up where you are going. So let me close with what is currently my most favorite quote, offered to us by that radical thinker and challenger of our times, Arundhati Roy. Arundhati says in a recent essay of hers, nothing could be worse than a return to normality. Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudices and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Srilata. That was wonderful, and an amazing bringing together of so many different things. So combining new things with things that are, as you said, very old, ancient philosophies, spiritual wisdom, and yes, drawing together in so many different ways. A lot of feminist thinking as well that has gone on through the times, in terms of that, emphasizing the personal and the political aspect of the personal. As you say, we haven't always been good at taking that within, but I think it's a very powerful call. And just to the wider public, this wasn't a setup in terms of having a well-being presentation to start off the conference. I didn't know what Srilata was going to be talking about and how many resonances there would be with the work of myself and colleagues over recent years. So we've already got some questions that are coming in. And I think what I'd like to do is to bring people up to the podium to give their questions, so that we have a sense of there being more people in the room than just the two of us. So I'd like to start with Sam Hickey from Manchester. Thank you.
Thanks. Morning, Srilata, and thanks very much for the talk. Enjoyed that, and completely on board with the call for thinking about social justice from a relational perspective. My query was around the framing, absencing and presencing, which I'm sure has got more to it than you had time to go through, but which seemed to have fairly strong sort of moral overtones of baddies versus goodies,
Yes.
in a way that doesn't really allow for relationships or coalitions to emerge between very different actors. And my understanding is that politics and progressive change is a fairly messy business that doesn't just involve the good guys. So what room in your framework do you have for coalition building across such divides?
Thank you, Sam. Shall I respond, Sarah?
Yes, please do.
Right. First of all, I want to be clear that this aspect of it is perhaps a flaw in my presentation, because I don't think the Present-Sick Institute's intention is to say that, these are the goodies and the baddies. I think what they've tried to do is to look at processes and dynamics. And so absencing is, these are like two spirals into which, people get drawn. So I don't think they are looking at this as individual blame, but as kind of larger sort of political dynamics that are drawing people into their slipstream, as it were. Yeah. So perhaps, I didn't do a very good job of conveying that nuance very clearly. That's one. And the second point, I think, to your question, is that I can't claim I'm offering a framework. What I'm saying is that all these interesting and innovative struggles that I have witnessed and studied and learned from have certainly had plenty of, plenty of mess, yeah, and plenty of sort of back and forth. And actually, it's, a friend of mine, the two of us, in fact, co-founded the first organization in Mumbai that worked with people living on the pavements, the pavement dwellers of Mumbai, Spark. Sheila Patel, she used to say, when you work for social change, It's always going to be 2 steps forward and 1 step back, if you're lucky. If you're lucky. And you're lucky it's not 1 step forward and 2 steps back. So yes, I think there is a scope for a lot of mess. I think the conundrum that you raise, which is the toughest one of all, which is how do we bridge the divide and how do we sort of bring people into, how do we attract more people to support visions of construction and inclusion, right? That how do we make exclusionary discourses and positions less attractive and less, disempower them from being able to mobilize, particularly people who are feeling very much. And I don't know yet. I haven't really got an answer for that. I think that to me is the heart of the toughest challenge we're facing in building this kind of discursive shift is exactly that. Because as Hannah Arendt told us from her study of, the rise of fascism in Germany 70 years ago or 80 years ago, our job is tough because our messages are not simplistic. They are not black and white, right? They're asking people to understand more nuanced ways of looking at things. And people who are selling exclusionary ideologies have the advantage of giving very black and white messages. A friend of mine who recently ordered an Uber cab in Delhi, 3 of them cancelled on her because she has a Muslim name. The 4th guy obviously hadn't seen her name and he showed up at the door and she got in and then he says, "Oh, you're a Muslim." She says, "Yes, what of it?" And he says, "Well, all the problems of this country are because of you." You see, so we don't have these kind of simple black and white messages to give people. Or maybe we should. I don't know. Maybe that's the challenge, that we haven't come up with a compelling way of communicating, a more inclusive, rights-based, and egalitarian vision.
Okay.
Anyway, I'll stop there.
Thanks.
Thanks, Sam. Okay, so I've got 2 questions I'd like to take together. And again, I'd like you to come up to the podium. So the first one is from Mahadika. I don't know how to pronounce the rest of your name, but you know who you are. From Erasmus University, Rotterdam. Mahadika, would you like to come up to the podium, please?
Just wondering, in this new cosmic vision or in our understanding of meshworks, where would the role or how do we position the nation state? Or how should we change our understanding of it, perhaps?
Okay, Mahadika, you've asked a really, really tough question. And you put me right on the spot. Because, I grew up in a very patriotic environment. Okay, my father was an extremely progressive person and he was a socialist and so on, but patriot, okay? And it's only in, the last maybe 15 or 20 years of my life when I came across this very transformative book that a colleague of mine, an East European colleague of mine at Ford Foundation made me read, and it's called Bury Me Standing. And it's a history of the Roma people. And I was fascinated because the Roma people don't recognize any concept of nationality because they believe the whole world is theirs. Their motto, the Roma saying is, the road is good. Okay, so you just travel, you go anywhere you want because the whole earth belongs to you. And interestingly, many indigenous people also have the same notion, right? That the earth is ours. And when I was doing popular education with poor rural women, largely Dalit and indigenous women in the northern parts of my province in South India, they would genuinely ask, I'm sorry, I'm answering your question in a very different way, okay? They would genuinely ask me the question, Akka, which means older sister, what is this India? Everybody, our children are going to school and they have to sing these songs and they have to say, what is this India? What is this Bharat? They had no concept of a nation state. They understood their village, they understood their caste, they understood the province or the district in which they were located, and that was it. And it didn't matter if they went to Delhi. I took some of them to Delhi. We had a big gathering and that sort of thing. It didn't make any difference. They just couldn't get. I'd show them a map. And they were like, what are all these lines? We don't understand. So I think it's very clear. What I understood is that the notion of the nation state is actually very alien to human beings. And that is why it's actually a very recent concept in historic terms. It's, a little less recent. If patriarchy is only around 10,000 years old, the nation state concept is probably what, 1,000 or maybe 2,000 years old. So I actually think it's an alien construct. I don't think it's at all something inherent to the way we identify. So I think the nation state has, on the one hand, become the biggest barrier to achieving the kind of human societies and ecological health that we need. And at the same time, unfortunately, they have lost their teeth as enforcers and regulators of any kind of genuine vision of development, because they have largely become instruments of other interests, which are certainly not bounded by any nation or state. And I don't have to name them. So I guess I've become a little bit of an anarchist, and I'm saying this on a public platform, but actually I've decided I am a Roma because, the Roma came from the northwestern part of the subcontinent, the South Asian subcontinent. So I consider myself a Roma. I don't believe in the nation state. I don't know if I've answered your question. So to me, Kwarbai, whether it is a 60-year-old president or a 30-year-old president, yes, I think it does. Age does make a difference. You've seen, for instance, how younger leaders, especially women prime ministers and presidents in countries like Taiwan and Finland and Denmark, and of course, New Zealand. Don't we all wish she was the head of our country? They are much younger, yes. But let's face it, very, very authoritarian ideologies are also throwing up young leaders who embrace those ideologies. So I don't want to get into this thing that it's about age. And I think Gandhi, when he was 70 years old, was in some ways a more radical thinker, though, he was a racist. Of course, I agree and I accept that. Mandela, in his 70s, was a much more radical thinker to me than many younger leaders. So I don't think it's so much about age. I think it's about, again, this thing of openness, willingness to learn, absorb new ideas, new thinking. Yeah.
Thank you. Nandini, would you like to give your question, please?
A bit long-winded and it got truncated. But the question was to do with your arguments about psychic transformation. These you, of course, present as tools for radical political transformation. But there are clearly strong ideological resonances with the idea of neoliberal self-making on the one hand, and on the other hand, closer to home for you and me, neo-Hindu notions of spirituality and self-making. So in our politics, how do we strategically distance ourselves from those and make sure your arguments are understood in a very different way from those ones? Because on the face of it, some may see you as saying somewhat similar things as they are doing. Thanks.
Thank you.
Very important question, Nandini. Thanks for raising it. My short answer would be by refusing to be cowed down by this, by forging a path that will reveal itself very quickly to be so fundamentally different, because it is about collective well-being. It's not about the neoliberal notion of, as I said in my talk, we've put that into this domain of the individual and the individual responsibility, and we don't approach it as something that is necessary for to build our collective strength and our collective power for change. And many of my colleagues at Gender at Work, for instance, who worked with women in Southern Africa who are HIV positive, who are survivors of severe violence, sexual and other forms of violence, they have, faced the same, allegation that they are doing all this sort of neoliberal kind of feel good healing and all that stuff. So I think what you have to do is to say it's like a certain time when I remember if I wore a Ganesh, the image of the Lord Ganesh around my neck, which I do most days. Oh, you're supporting Hindutva. How dare you seize the right of that symbol? How dare you seize the meaning of what that symbol represents? And how dare you try to intimidate me, the so-called radicals, into giving that up in order to establish my radical credentials, right? So I think this is the problem. This is also part of what has kept us from venturing into this terrain, is because we are afraid of being labeled as, a sort of soft Hindutva or neolib, new age self-development kind of stuff. And I think for me, I now am just sick of that therefore we keep seeding that terrain, So it reminded me of the moment when in our meetings of our street level collectives and our village collectives, when we began to talk about religion, it was in 87, 88, when the whole Hindutva process was building up nationally. And we began to talk about it, and we began to talk about how Dalit women experienced their own spiritual being. And, we were trashed by both feminist and sort of leftist leaning groups all over the country, because the women said, we are going to build a small shrine of our own because we want a place of worship of our own. We want our own space. We don't want to keep fighting to go to that mainstream temple, because in any case, that's not the idol that we worship. So, this is how we've seeded that terrain to those with a very different agenda. So my strategy is claim that terrain, and very soon they'll see how different it is, because trans women are coming and worshipping there. Sex workers are coming and worshipping there. So you're demonstrating your politics in action rather than in some kind of a tract that you're preaching. So I feel we have to reclaim, we have a right to claim our own space. And I think we have to construct our politics in those spaces without fear. I don't know if you feel I've addressed it, but I feel kind of quite passionately about this.
No, thank you. I completely agree with what you're saying.
Thank you. Okay, so we've got two more questions. We've got lots more questions actually, but two more that I think go together. First of all, from Damilola. Are you still there? Yes, Damilola Agbalajobi. And followed by Neil Webster from DHS or DNS. Can't see.
Okay, my question is, how do we create and construct a world where we have the basic 15 needs identified, sustainable development goals, that will meet the basic needs of humans in situations where our leaders lack social and political will? Because most of the challenges we have in the global south is our leaders having the will to take some decisions and policies. So what do you think can be done? Does it mean our cases are hopeless in such situations?
No, I don't
We
think
just
it
hold on,
means
Srilata. We've got just one more that kind of comes in along the same lines, I think.
Okay. Sorry.
Neil.
Yes, hello. Yeah, very interesting and thought-provoking, but it just made me think, how do we choose our leaders, or how do leaders become leaders? And perhaps linked to this, how do they carry authority, or how are they authorized on the basis of their relationship to us? And how do they remain accountable?
Okay, let me try and connect the two. Because actually, I think part of what I was going to say in response is there in Andrew Henk's question or comment, where he talks about the deep democracy concept and the shift the power sort of campaign. I actually think that, look, I can't claim that I have answers for all these incredibly important questions. Okay, so please let me start by saying I can only give you my very limited insight on these things. So my belief is that because of what I said about the nation state and also this reclaiming space in response to how religion fundamentalists define, for instance, spiritual practice, etc. I think it's the same thing. I think it's about claiming some spaces. Forget about changing national policy, etc. Yeah, I mean, not forget about it. I think we have to remain part of campaigns for greater sort of global accountability and justice, and really campaigning against, on the climate crisis. We have to keep acting there in those kinds of processes and spaces. But I think in terms of the alternative, it is really the shift the power type of action that we have to invest in. Because what happens is when you create, and I have seen this, and I'm seeing it even right now, in fact, in the course COVID pandemic, the kind of alternatives that communities have created at very local levels, because the state was not bothering, they were not responding, they were not providing the necessary aid or relief or support or whatever. They worked out these solutions, very powerful, interesting, very community-driven solutions, like chasing the virus in, the largest slum in the country in Mumbai, Dharavi, where communities joined with local health officials and figured out a way of ensuring that, because it's a highly densely populated area, you can't do social distancing. You have to assume everybody is exposed and could at least 50% may become active, etc. So I think it's those kinds of solutions that we have to invest a lot of energy in, because what happens then is that they begin to demonstrate, then other communities say, okay, we'll also try this, creating local markets, for instance, for certain kind of produce. In Africa, I've seen the campaign against Chinese goods, showing a slipper, made by Maasai people. And okay, so this costs, 200 shillings, and this Chinese imported plastic slipper costs 50 shillings. And saying 6 months later, here's the Maasai slipper. It's still the same as it was when you bought it. And here's the Chinese slipper. This has broken. They've put a safety pin to attach the strap here. It's gone, So I think people are using very creative ways at the local level, and then that starts to kind of like how some of these plant forms and bacteria do, they just start spreading laterally. So I don't know what the eventual thing is going to be, whether that lateral spread will eventually lead to the state structures having to shift their paradigm, because that's what I'm seeing a little bit now, is because of these local experiments in handling COVID, a lot of state governments are now saying, okay, let's try that because that worked over there, So I think we have to do things along those lines. And so meanwhile, of course, Neil, I'm sorry, I forgot your question is, because I can't see it here anymore. Yes, here. How do we choose our leaders? How do we Oh, I thought, it's interesting. I read it as, how do we become our leaders? How do they become leaders? Well, I think this is the thing, that our political systems have really become quite rotten, haven't they? Because all the structural mechanisms to access formal political leadership, they're all corroded, right? Political parties, I know that's true in England. It's certainly true across South Asia. When we were trying to increase, the number of women getting tickets to run for elections, the parties would just say outright to their faces, you have to bring this much money to the party coffers. So straight away, 90% of the women have no such resources. They say, no, we'll bring votes, we'll bring, popular support, we can mobilize a lot of volunteers. No, you put 20 million rupees on the table and then we'll talk, So the political machinery has become so corroded that I don't have an answer. I really don't know how we're going to fix that. I think and I used to believe that the option was to have that third block, that third alternative party or whatever. And we had one which came up very promisingly about 10 or 15 years ago. And they've gotten elected to the Delhi state government, and they've done a very good job of governance there. Not in the COVID situation, but prior to that. But they haven't been able to, capture the national imagination. So I think what we need is some really bright young leaders. And, if we can create sort of meshworks. But the problem is we're very poor at working together. This is where I'm saying there's a lot of relational work that we have to do within the sort of progressive movements themselves. Because the minute they come together and try to form some kind of an alternative in a political space, they get into the same power struggle and tussle and, why should he be nominated and why should she be nominated? So I'm sorry, I can't give you anything.
Okay, so we've got a further question, which is taking us in a slightly different direction, from Trent Brown, University of Minnesota.
Well, it's interesting because I see this actually as a very related question. I have been inside, I think, one of the ultimate old academic hierarchies of Harvard University. And I remember pretty much being treated like some insect that crawled in. Absolutely no account, because of course I was adjunct this and adjunct that or whatever. How do we transform? Because the academy is a microcosm of the sort of feudal power structure, right? The academy is based on a feudal system, right? You have the lords, the dukes, and the duchesses, and then whoever, the earls, and then the sort of baronies or whatever, the assistant professors, and then you have the sort of serfs and the vassals or the graduate students and students. Well, I'll tell you one thing which I do see as a possible lever for changing that toxicity. And of course, it's a very patriarchal structure as well, because it's a feudal structure, right? It's feudal patriarchy. So I think that there are two approaches in looking at how development scholars can work within this and work on the psychic challenge. One is within yourself, of deciding how much do you want to climb up that ladder. And because you know that if you want to climb up that ladder, there are certain ways you have to modify your conduct and your demeanor and so on. Quite apart from what the quality of your academic work is, there are certain sort of forms of, shall I say, subservience that are required sometimes. So I think one part of the psychic challenge is deciding on that what's your end goal? Is it that you want to be the head of that department or whatever? And then you have to sort of play that game. You have to adopt the whole set of feudal norms. And the other challenge, I think, is to decide, how am I going to behave with my colleagues and my fellow scholars and my students and, the people that are in my little meshwork. And what I did in Harvard was that I created a different kind of meshwork where I was located. My classes were always no standing room, even kids sitting on the steps in between the amphitheater chairs. And my research assistants, my colleagues who I did research with, we created our own culture of collegiality and shared intellectual, work. It was not competitive, because this is the other thing that's very destructive in that culture, which is so toxic, is the competitiveness, your citation index, your publications, and so on. So we made it a practice that even if it was my idea, we would always do co-authored pieces. So we would write things together, we would publish together, we would distribute the intellectual work, we would distribute the benefits and the accolades, if any, and the brickbats, of course. So we tried to create a culture of collective thinking and collective production there. And that is possible. And by doing that, you slowly start to infect the larger system. And each of us decided we didn't want to be the head of the center, of the head of the Hauser Center, or a professor, tenured professor.
Okay, so we've got a question from Temitope. I'm aware we've only got a couple more minutes, so Temitope, if you don't mind, I'll just, yes, we'll publish it rather than bringing you forward. It's a very difficult question, I think, probably to finish with. So how do we promote?
Temitope, it's a very powerful question, and I have absolutely no answer. I mean, I have some answer in my context, but that doesn't mean it'll work in yours. You know, I know you're also facing the rise of, very Wahhabi Islam on one side and, very sort of born again Christianity on the other, and so on. So I don't know how you carve this third space, but I do know one thing is that what worked very well for us is to not make it look, not even call it a spiritual process, not make it resemble any kind of spiritual process. So you start with very kind of creative explorations of the self as though they are related to the social change work that we want to do. So we started, for instance, by examining the patriarchy within. How have we as women internalized patriarchy? How are we practicing it in our daily lives, in our homes? So we started with that kind of intent. How has it made me feel inside? How do I feel about myself? Those kind of questions. That's how we began. Don't call it the spiritual journey, because then you're waving a red flag.
And I guess you're also reproducing that idea of separate spheres.
Yeah.
Away from anything else.
But we did this as very integrated and as part of this deeper change that we wanted to create, by saying that we are part of the change and let's begin from within us. What is our internal world? That sort of thing. See, it depends on what you define as spiritual also, doesn't it, Sarah?
It does.
Because this for me is a very spiritual process. I mean, how do we feel connected to each other? What connects us? That kind of thing. That's also spirituality.
Good. And I think that's a great place on which to stop. I'm sorry to those of you who still had questions that we haven't been able to take, but I think it's been a wonderful beginning to the conference, laying all sorts of questions open for us, and really expanding the territory of our thinking about leadership. So thank you, Shalata. I'm not sure that we can have a virtual clap, but if we could.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.